Well, on behalf of all of the organizers, I want to welcome you to the 5th International Workshop on Network Theory. This year's theme, of course, is Network Science Meets the Science of Teams, but I wanted to make sure that I provide a little background about the series. The 5th of these international workshops on network theory has been now the 5th incarnation of an enduring and enjoyable collaboration that has as its two anchors the Annenberg Networks Network at University of Southern California, the Annenberg School of Communication, and the Science of Networks and Communities Research Group, SONIC, at Northwestern. And during these 5 years, we have alternated the venues of these workshops. They've always been on different themes. Some of the themes are listed on the inside cover of the brochure, that in previous years it was on interdisciplinary approaches to social network theory, network multidimensionality, web science meets network science, network social movements and network theory, and this year it's on network science meets the science of teams. Some of you may wonder why we didn't keep the symmetry and why not call it network science meets team science. Well, part of the issue is that that word team science is appropriated by some parts of the community as referring to science that is done in teams, and so to disambiguate that, we refer to it as network science meets the science of teams. This year, the ANSONIC Alliance has been joined by Nico, Brian representing Nico here as the co-director. In fact, Brian and Nico has also previously collaborated with one of these workshops when it was held here 2 years ago, which was called Web Science Meets Network Science. We are also delighted this year to have as a collaborating partner the Delta Lab at Georgia Institute of Technology. Leslie DeChurch directs that. And in part, a lot of what is going to be done today is we obviously have had sponsorship from Northwestern, but a lot of the funding for this workshop also comes from a National Science Foundation building communities and capacity research project that Leslie and I are co-PIs on. And so that's part of the reason why we are very grateful to the National Science Foundation that even though the government is shut down, we continue to do business here. I'm going to have Peter say a few words on behalf of the Annenberg Networks Network, and then we're going to try to get caught up on time, and we're now about 3 minutes behind schedule for Brian's talk. But I want to make sure that I welcome you all. Thank you so many of you for coming for this trip. I know some of you had a little difficulty with O'Hare yesterday, but that's not entirely news to most of you who travel a lot. I will say that even though the substantive themes of this workshop have changed from year to year, one of the enduring themes in terms of the process is that this is a highly interactive section. Many of you are here and are not formally presenting. There's only a subset of people who are formally presenting papers, but the richness of the conversation and the dialogue that we've had in previous years is what is part of the signature of this workshop. And I certainly hope that that continues today and that we'll have a chance to spend a lot of our time and effort in those interactive sessions, which is why we want the presentations, even though we have 45 minutes, we want the presentations to be closer to 20 minutes or 25 minutes at most, and then essentially spend half the time on discussion, formal discussion in the session, as well as then subsequently. Many of you know that this is being streamed live, and there is a Twitter hashtag. The Twitter hashtag is TeamNetSci, TeamNetSci. It's also listed on the cover, the bottom of the brochure that you have here. So we have some folks that we have designated as tweeters for this workshop, but feel free to chime in and at least observe it, even if you're not necessarily doing it. Okay. With that, I want to welcome Peter Manji. As I said, the ANSONIC Alliance has been at the core of this series of workshops, and I'd like Peter to say a few words to welcome you on behalf of the AN part of the ANSONIC.
I just wanted to join Nosh in welcoming you to this workshop. It's been a great partnership over the last 5 years, and we've really enjoyed doing it, and I always go away from these workshops feeling renewed and energized and with lots of new ideas, so I'm sure that will be the case this time as well. I wanted to welcome you on behalf of Janet Falk and myself and Manuel Castells, and particularly Manuel, who has been at all of these previous meetings and was planning to be here, asked me to convey his greetings and his his regret at not being able to be here. The good side of his not being able to be here is that he just received notification a couple of weeks ago that he won the Bolzan Award, which is the highest prize that is given by the country of Switzerland. But what comes along with that is not only the preparation of a major address to the Academy of Sciences, but he has to coordinate and organize 3 research projects, all of which are due on the 15th of October. So he sends his best wishes, his greetings, and promises to be at the next session. So thanks very much, welcome, and let's have a great time.
So there are a couple of housekeeping things. In case you haven't noticed in your brochure, there is information, instructions on how to get onto the Wi-Fi. If you're having problems with that, please let us know. You should not have problems with that, but in case you do, please let us know. You may have also noticed in your program brochure that you have this little metallic piece, and at least a couple of people didn't quite realize it, wondering what it is, but it's a USB drive, and it has, I think it's loaded with up to 16 gigs. So it's supposed to be like a business card that you could put into your wallet and carry around, etc. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Okay, so now, 6 minutes behind schedule. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Brian Uzzi, who is going to kick off the session this morning with a talk that is titled Atypical Knowledge and Scientific Impact. I think everyone knows that Brian is one of the organizers, obviously the co-director of the Northwestern Institute of Complexity and the faculty at Kellogg and several other departments on campus. I'm particularly pleased to introduce Brian today because the talk that he's going to give is one that has just been accepted in Science. So we get to see
All right, very good. So, all right, good morning, everyone. Nasha, I'm going to try to get us back on time. So we're here to talk about networks and teams. I'm going to talk about a certain kind of that. I'm going to talk about human social networks. In science, I'm going to talk about information networks that has to do with their citation work. And I'm going to talk about how teams impact your ability to take those two things and do more with it in your scientific work. I want to go into the world of creativity. I want to try to figure out what is it that makes for a creative piece of scientific work. The big picture here is that I'm going to go into the Web of Science, largest known repository of all scientific work published on the planet. I'm going to go into every paper in the Web of Science, and I'm going to code it for its level of conventional knowledge and novelty. I'm then going to look at what kinds of combinations of conventional knowledge and novelty produce the highest impact science. I think many of us have a belief that what we're really looking for in science is novelty. And what we're going to find is that science on a whole is not novel. Science on a whole is highly conventional. Novelty, however, does pay off, but novelty only pays off if it is embedded at the very frontier of conventional knowledge. In fact, creativity in science really is about pushing on two boundaries simultaneously. Pushing out onto the frontier of where convention is, well-known, established, accepted knowledge, and introducing some novelty to that. I'm also going to show that that is related to the kind of team structure that you get, that you work in. Very quickly, to give some background, the big picture of this is, we've done a lot of work in the science of science. There's lots of fundamental work that has been done years ago by Zuckerman and Merton and DeSola Price. Large databases allow us to look at this problem in new ways. One problem that I want to look at is the problem of creativity. Lots of people believe that creativity really comes about when you take fresh ideas and you put them together and you spur on new innovation. There's lots of examples in science that go along with this. Marie Curie, she put together radioactivity and neoplasm, so on and so forth. You could probably think of quite a few on your own. Now, one of the most interesting things once you get into the creativity literature is that the high focus on novelty is often looked at in the sense that we don't have enough of it. We're always looking for ways to create more novelty. In fact, many of us probably teach ways for people to be novel because we put such an emphasis on it. One of my favorite examples of that and just how difficult it is to get novelty comes from the Coen brothers. I don't know how many of you know the Coen brothers. They're filmmakers. Their first film was called Blood Simple. They've won a number of Oscars since then. But Blood Simple made them famous because that story had so many unexpected twists and turns that it appeared very novel. But the story about how they did that is really a story about introducing novelty. How do you get it? Because it seems so hard and we value it so much. So for those of you that were interested in this case, the Coen brothers came up with their own methodology for doing that. They had actually written a script on Blood Simple, and it wound up being a pretty conventional whodunit detective story. They wanted to add some novelty, so they got the script, and they literally cut paragraph after paragraph of the script apart. They put all the strips of paper together into a hat. They shook it up on their parents' living room floor in Minnesota. They threw it up in the air, and then they put the pieces together at random. And then they rewrote the entire story around that new story that was essentially put together at random. And that's what made their work so novel. Now, as we began thinking about this question, we began looking for more novelty, ways in which novelty would be important. But what we found was that there was a twist in that. And it really came when I stumbled upon a book that many of us know the name of, but probably haven't looked at. It's Darwin's The Origin of Species. Now, this is a book that is lauded over and over again for its great creativity. It had this gigantic idea that changed everything that we think about, whether it's ecology all the way over to economics. And when you open that book, you approach it by thinking that it's going to be about that big idea. But when you open it, it's quite the opposite. It's really a lot about conventional knowledge. The whole first third of that book is about the breeding of dogs, something that was well known at the time. It was deep conventional knowledge. The next third of the book was about the breeding of cattle, specifically Hereford cattle, which was a little less well known. Those are the cattle with the white faces. And the last third of the book is about the breeding of birds, which at the time was slightly exotic, but it really flowed very evenly from ideas of conventional knowledge about the breeding of other types of animals. And it's only in the last 70 pages does he actually put forth his big idea. He had this great idea, but embedded it deeply in conventional knowledge, right at the frontier. He went from dogs to cattle to birds. Did a little more looking around, and you find out that that's not that uncommon. Newton's Principia also has something of this structure. If you read about the history of it, he first invents the calculus so that he could then derive the laws of the universe. But when he publishes the Principia, he leaves the calculus out. In fact, what he does is he goes through this deep, painstaking process of reproving everything that he discovered with calculus with conventional geometry. And the entire book is about the conventional geometry that leads to the next step, which is these laws of physics. It's not until the 4th edition of this book does he include his original work on calculus. This got us thinking that there may be a very deep relationship between conventionality and novelty. And that's what I'd like to share with you, what this looks like. As I mentioned before, I'm going to go into the web of science. I'm going to look at every paper from 1950 to the year 2000. I'm going to code each of these papers for their level of conventional knowledge and level of novelty. And I'm then going to look for the relationship between those quantities of each paper and that paper's ability to be a hit. The bottom line is this. It turns out that in science, over this period, across all fields, what you find is that the papers that do best push you all the way to the boundary of conventional knowledge and add new novelty to that. Creativity is really about moving along these two frontiers, not one versus the other. I'm also going to show you work that shows that if you work in teams, you're not only more likely to source novelty more often, so teams relative to individual authors bring more novelty into their papers more frequently. You'll also see that given the same level of novelty and conventionality in a paper by an individual and by a team, the team does more with that mixture. So teams seem to be better not only at sourcing novelty, but also at assimilating it. So how do we want to think about this? How do we go about it? Let me try to give you the intuition to our methodology. What we believe is conventional knowledge is not knowledge that you've seen many times before. It's knowledge that you are familiar with, that you recognize when it's put together. And novelty is knowledge that hasn't been put together before. So our basic methodology was to do the following. We're going to go into the web of science. We're going to extract each paper. We're going to go into each paper and we're going to look at the knowledge that it draws upon. The way we're going to look at the knowledge it draws upon is we're going to go into its reference section. And we're going to look at each pair of references. And what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the observed frequency of every pair of references that appear together. That means references that have appeared together in pairs many times in the past are conventional. And the more they've appeared together in the past, the more conventional knowledge it is. Novelty is going to be pairs of knowledge that haven't been put together before. We're going to make that calculation with the observed data. We are then going to go through a process of going back into the Web of Science, and we are going to randomize every single pair over and over again. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a random baseline to compare the observed to what would be expected simply by chance. When we have those two quantities, we have a conventional z-score. The more positive that z-score is, the more conventional the pairing is. The more negative that z-score is, that is below 0, the more novel it is. Once we have that, for every pair in every paper, each paper then has a distribution of pairs, doesn't it? Some of those pairs will be conventional, some will be novel, so on and so forth. And from that distribution, we will characterize your paper as being conventional, novel, or some mixture of both. I'm going to begin by showing you the data for the whole Web of Science. And then what I'm going to do is break it down, field by field. I'm going to begin to use different cutoffs for different levels of novelty to show one underlying factor. And that is that the results that I've talked about have a universality. They appear across time and across fields. The work that I'm going to present is with some colleagues of mine. One is in the room, Satya Mukherjee, postdoc at NICO. Ben Jones, one of my colleagues at Kellogg, and Mike Stringer, a former postdoc who's now running a data analytics firm. So let me go through a quick example. Let's begin with just a paper. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. So here's a paper, Synthesis of the 5 Natural Cannabis Spirits. I chose this paper as an example because it has the word cannabis in it. I'm then going to go to its reference section. This is a piece of the reference section right here. So this says, here's an article that it's cited, another article it's cited, another article it's cited, so on and so forth. Remember I said I was going to look at pairs? Well, imagine this. I go to the first 2 pairs that appeared in those 2 top journals. Very difficult names to pronounce. I'm going to look at that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, how often does this pair appear together that year and into the past? It could appear a lot, or it could appear for the first time. I'm going to look at this pair, so on and so forth for the entire paper. Once I have that, I have an observed frequency of pairings. The more those observed frequencies have been seen together, the more conventional it is, the more accustomed we are to seeing those pairings. Once I do that, I'm going to go through the whole process of doing the same process again, but this time I'm going to do it by randomizing all the citations. So you got the Web of Science, you got the observed citation relationships, and then what you do is you take all the observed ones and you simply mash them together at random. And you do that multiple times. And when you do that, you get an expected frequency of what that pairing should be. I'm going to raise this pairing to the journal level, but every time I do the random shuffling, it's all at the paper level. So once I do that, I'm going to go through this bootstrap method. Now let me just tell you a little bit about this bootstrap method. If you're going to do this, there's quite a few complexities you've got to worry about. You've got to make sure that you get the distributions of citations right because they're skewed. You've got to make sure that you get backward citations properly and frontward citations properly. So we went through this painstaking process that if Balazs writes a paper in 2000 and it cites a paper in 99, 98, and 97, when we do the randomization, he gets a randomized link to his citations that were also in 99, also in 98, and also in 97. We also make sure that if his paper in 2000 is cited in 2001, 2002, and 2005, it gets cited again in those same years. So we are, in essence, maintaining the underlying structure of reverse citations and forward citations. We do this through all the Web of Science, 500 million citations, so on and so forth. It's a real big data project, but in the end, we come up with this random model. So, what does that look like? It looks basically like this. Let's go back to the cannabis paper. I'm just going to show you a piece of it. Here are 2 journals, and what you, oops, sorry, this is a little messed up. Just look at this column, please. The observed times that this has appeared together is 5,000. It's a lot. People have seen this a lot together. These two journals a little bit less, but it's still a lot. These two journals a little bit less, but it's still a lot, so on and so forth. Now, if you look at these journals, it's much lower. These two journals appear only 114 times. These two only appear 16 times, so on and so forth. That's the observed. I then go, and now please just look at this column, the expected. What you see here is when we do our randomization, although this appeared 5,000 plus times together, in the randomized model, on average, it should only have appeared 151 times. So that's a lot more conventional than you'd expect simply by chance. So conventionality is always being compared to what you'd expect by chance. And it's updated every year so that the Web of Science is expanding, so that there's more fields and so on and so forth. We're always comparing to the same third factor. So, notice here, here's the observed, the expected. The observed is greater than the expected, so on and so forth. Here, the observed is less than the expected. The bottom four, these are appearing less than you'd expect by chance. For us, these are novel combinations. And the way we measure that is by looking at that z-score. If you have the z-score above 0, it's a conventional mixture. And the higher the z-score, the more conventional it is. If it's below 0, it's novel. And the greater it's below 0, the more novel it is. Okay? That's the basic structure. Once you do that, more conventionality, more novelty, you can actually build a distribution for every single paper. Here's the distribution for this particular paper. Its lowest z-score is down here at minus 45, and that's what you see here. And then this cumulative distribution gives you a sense of what the distribution looks like throughout the paper. Every paper can be categorized like that. Now, let me go one more step and then get to results. What I want to show you is that once you do this, what does the whole population look like in terms of conventionality and novelty? Are we more novel or are we more conventional? So here's what we're going to do. Your paper's got this distribution, right? The central tendency of the distribution will give us a sense of the central tendency of that paper's distribution gives us a sense if that paper is more conventional or more novel. So if the central tendency is very positive, has a very positive z-score, it means that lots of things in that paper have been seen before together. So it's very conventional. If the z-score is low, it means that many things in that paper haven't been seen before together. So look at this. This gives you an idea of the median conventionality of all the papers published in the decade of 1980 to 1989 and 1990 to 2000. The dashed line, I'm going to put at 0 on the z-score, because remember the 0 is a good point at which to look at novelty and conventionality. What you can see here is that science is a highly conventional undertaking. You find that most papers, so you go to the 50th percentile of this distribution, say you're looking at its mean basically in your mind, what you can find is most papers are highly conventional. Most of the central tendency of what people cite is stuff that's been seen before together. Now, we also care about that paper's novelty. How are we going to look at that? What we're going to say is you've got the distribution. Your most novel stuff in every paper is going to be way out in your left-hand tail, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at that bottom 10 percentile of the left-hand tail. And that'll tell us how novel the most novel stuff in your paper is. This is what that distribution looks like, again, for everything in the Web of Science. And what you can see here again is if you go to the z-score of 0, the 10th percentile of papers, this 10th percentile of papers, about 40% of them have a left tail that's below 0. They have some novelty. Do they have a lot of novelty? Well, about 20% have a good amount of novelty. An analogy that we used when we were working on this that helped us think about it was imagine you were trying to categorize a basketball team's height. You could get the height of all the players, and the taller the players are on the team, the higher its median conventionality would be, the higher its central tendency would be, right? But you might also say, but that doesn't tell me if there are some short players on the team, some 5'10" guys that may move around really fast. You know about those guys, the real kind of novel piece? You've got to look at that left-hand tail. And that's what we do here. So now we've got papers categorized. What these distributions tell you is that science really on a whole is very conventional, and some papers have a left-hand tail of novelty. Lots of papers have all conventionality. Now, let's go and do our first test and get to a result. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a simple non-parametric test, and we're not going to massage any of the data. We're just going to look at the raw data. And here's how we're going to break it up. We're going to go to a 2x2. And what we're going to look at is tail novelty. And what we're going to say is, does your paper, 10th percentile of its distribution, that's its lowest left-hand tail, is it below 0 or not? If it's below 0, it's got some novelty. If not, it doesn't. And that's what this dimension is going to be. You've got high tail novelty if, in fact, you're below a z-score of 0, and you've got low tail novelty if you're above 0. Up here would be a basketball team that's got some players under 5'10". Here would be a basketball team that doesn't. And then what we're going to do is going to look at the median conventionality of each paper, its central tendency. Here again, what we're going to say is, you've got low median conventionality. You've got less conventionality than everybody else if your conventionality of your paper's distribution is below the population distribution. So we're going to make it relative to the population. And then we're going to say you've got high median conventionality if you're above it. Once we do that, we can start to cut the data. And here we get some interesting things. If you're in a paper that's got high median conventionality, you're right at the frontier of the most conventional thinking in that field, and you also have some novelty mixed in, here you've got convention with some extension. If you're here, you've got a lot of conventionality, but you really have no novelty. It's all established knowledge that you're pulling on. If we go up here, this is kind of like, very avant-garde stuff. It's got a lot of novelty, but very little conventionality. It's like, off-Broadway theater where like the music, the players don't even look at the audience. They get their back to you, and they don't speak in words. They speak like in dolphin clicks. It's like very strange stuff, okay? And then over here is a paper that's somehow lost between these dimensions. It's not really conventional, and it's not really novel. We do this, and we look to see what's the probability of a hit in each of these categories. Probability of a hit, just to start us off, is going to be the top 5% of the distribution. So you're a hit if you're in that top 5%. And when we do that, here we go again. I'm going to lay out those same 4 dimensions, okay? And then I'm going to look to see for the probability of a hit. Remember, when you're looking at this, the background rate of a hit in any one of those categories should be 5%. If you do better than 5%, you're doing better than what you'd expect with the background rate. That's our comparison. So when we do that, here is what we get. What you find is that being in the classification of lots of conventionality, or at the frontier of conventionality, and you've added some novelty, you've got about twice the probability of having a hit than you do in any other category. If you look at being just conventional with no novelty, guess what? Your probability of having a hit is just slightly above that 5% background rate. It's not really very much. If you're really novel, so you've got a lot of novelty and no conventionality, you're really just at the background rate. So as much as we care about things that are really novel, in the end, we don't really favor them in any particular way that would be expected more than chance. Where you don't want to be is here. Here, your probability of being a hit is only about 2%, lower than the background rate. So basically what you find is that if you're in that sweet spot, that green tower, this is like the Darwin hypothesis. You've got tons of conventionality, and you add some novelty to it, you've got about twice the background, you've got about twice the probability of a hit than you do from the next 2 categories. And if you compare it to the lowest category, you're about 6 times more likely to have a hit. Now that's with a single paper. Think about if you were to compound that over your career, that actually winds up being quite a big difference in your ability to make an impact. These are our basic findings to start. Now let me show you a little stress testing and then get to the last piece and close. We were really caring a lot about here about universality. So we put all the data together in the Web of Science. We mixed together all the different fields. We've got ecology mixed with neuroscience, with sociology, with zoology, with so on and so forth. And we're only looking at the 5% cutoff, and we're only looking at a 10% tail. What about if we start to move these things around? Do we still find the same effects? That's what I want to talk about here. So let's go back to the 4 towers. Remember the green tower? That's the Darwin hypothesis. And our cutoff was hit papers in the top 5%. What happens if we say the we're not just going to look at the top 5%. We care about that top 1%, the real cream of the cream. That's up here at the top. And when we look at that, what you'll see is, again, the Darwin hypothesis dominates. If we decide to loosen that a little bit, because, hey, I'd like to be in just the top 10%, I'd be pretty happy. Again, what you find is the Darwin hypothesis dominates. Similar pattern now, no matter how we cut that. And again, what we're looking at, too, is we're not just looking at 1980 or 1990, we're looking at the decade of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Everything that's there, we have this universal apparent pattern. I could go one step further, and I could say, what about if we do this? I cared about that left tail of 10% of novelty. What about if you said to me, well, I don't care about 10%. What about, if we go all the way down to 1%? Is that really where the action is? If we go all the way up to 20%, is that really where the action is? And again, that's what we do here. Now, this is what we show in the paper. That 10% left tail, shortest people on the basketball team. What about if we go to 5%? Guess what? We get the same effect. If we go to a single percent, we get the same effect. If we go to the 20th percentile, we get the effect, but once we go to the 30th percentile, we no longer get it. So that says that this is a pretty robust finding. The last thing we do is we break it up field by field. We now run the same exact analysis, except we're going to go into each field separately. If you care about business, we go into business. You care about psychology, we go into psychology. You care about communications, we go into communications, so on and so forth. And when you summarize it, look down here. Again, the Darwin hypothesis, see? What you find is, what dominates? In 65% of the fields, the Darwin hypothesis is the one in which you get the biggest hit. If you take the first two rankings, you find out that 85% of the fields conform to our results. So for us, this said we've got some real universality. Now, I want to talk about one last thing and then close, because I want to try to finish early. I want to talk about the relationship between teams. Quite a bit of work has been done on teams, basically showing that team science is related to impact. What we wanted to know is, how do teams relate to conventionality and novelty? I'm going to just put up a couple of slides here, and I'm not going to describe them. But basically what this slide says is that there's more and more work being done in teams across all areas of science and in patents. What this slide says is that people who work in your team written papers are associated with being bigger hits than solo written papers. That's kind of the bottom line. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail on this, but it says teams receive more citations relative to single authors. This is like a relative risk ratio. So there's some relationship between teamwork. Now you can think it could be due to a lot of different stuff. It could be division of labor. It could be more skills on the team. What we cared about was its relationship to conventionality and novelty. Again, this is reinforcing some of those things. So I'm going to go into, I'll first look at this. So here's tail novelty. That's that bottom 10%. Here's your novel combinations. Here's your conventional combinations. And what you can see here is that teams are more likely to source novel combinations than are pairs than are solos. So teams are associated with more novel combinations in every paper than are individuals. And what we find is there's no difference in conventionality. It turns out that teams are no more likely to be conventional than individuals. All the action in teams is in that novelty. It's in grasping novelty. So, last piece now. Let's put it all together and I go to a close. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the results that I just showed you and I'm going to break it up for how it works with solo scientists, pairs of scientists working together, and teams. So, let's look at solo scientists to start. That's where we are over here. So, here's our probability of a hit. Remember the 5%, top 5%? The probability of it being a hit, okay, tail novelty, how much tail novelty is in there. And here is conventionality. Now before I looked at conventionality by saying you were above the median or below, and now what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to bin the data. So now I'm binning conventional percentiles. Very low convention. More and more and more and more convention in the paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see if, one, your paper has tail novelty or does not, or has high tail novelty. So I'm just going to break those things up into pairs. So basically what I'm saying is this. Here's conventionality held at every level. Here's whether the paper has got high tail novelty at this level of conventionality, or it's got low tail novelty at this level of conventionality. That's all that this is saying. All right? Now what you can see here is something pretty interesting. As you become more and more conventional, what you can see is your probability of having a hit goes up. But past some threshold, your probability of a hit slows and then reverses. So if you're way, way too conventional, it begins to hurt you. So if you're in that really, really end of it, it's not good. But what you can see here is the clear pattern that no matter how you cut conventionality, high tail novelty beats out low tail novelty. So always having that introduction of something new and novel is going to help you, even if you're an individual. Now, if you look at duo authors, what you find is you get the same pattern of results. Increasing conventionality is good, up to just about the last thing. So you want to get right to that frontier, but not make the whole paper about that. Guess what? You're doing better. Again, if you have high tail novelty, if you've got high tail novelty, beats out low tail novelty. And then finally, we're going to go one more. And here's where we're going to see teams. And again, teams have the same pattern. But the thing that's important about breaking it up like this is, look at the drift. Teams are always doing better. That means that if I were to take a solo authored paper right here at its peak, 85% conventionality and high tail novelty, and compare that to a team that's got 85% conventionality and high tail novelty, guess what? The teams do better. That means that any mixture of conventionality and novelty, teams outdo other forms of scientific organization. Teams are better at sourcing that novelty, and they're better at putting it together. So, what are the takeaways here? High tail novelty is in fact always better than low tail novelty. Meeting conventionality is better, so you want to get to that frontier, but you don't want it to be complete. And then finally, given the same material, teams do better than other structures. To leave you with this, what do we want to do next? Our next piece here is to try to put this together into a theory. We have a theory that's running along something like the burden of knowledge and why it's working like this. And here's the basic idea. If you look at the frontier of science, it's constantly expanding. But every scientist can only see a piece of it, because we only have so much time and energy and cognitive capacity. But guess what? Because the boundary of science is constantly expanding, each of us sees a smaller and smaller fraction of that frontier, no matter how hard we try. If that's the case, the only way we're probably going to be able to bring that novelty in is, in fact, in teams. But it also has other implications. One implication would be that we would expect to see science drifting each year more and more to conventionality, because it's going to be harder and harder to reach across science to get that novelty. That's one of the things we're looking at now. Is, in fact, science becoming increasingly conventional every year that it goes by? We would also speculate that the hit papers, there will be fewer of them, and the few that do exist will be even bigger and bigger citation grabbers. The reason for that is that the frontier is constantly growing. And let's just presume that you can only reach out in 5 different places at a time. What's going to happen is that frontier gets bigger, we're probably going to be reaching for the same few places. So if I want to think of a paper in sociology, I think of Burke. If I want to think of a paper in complex systems, I think of Watts and Strogatz. And other people will do the same thing, because as that frontier gets bigger, we're going to be more and more constrained to be able to keep only a fewer and fewer things in our heads. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have 2 roving microphones, and
Is
we need the microphones for the recordings. So let's.
We're going to make this a web service so we can submit our papers, get a rating, change the citation.
Yeah, we're going to be the Dow Jones of science, yeah. You know, it's funny that you say that, though, because the editor at Science actually wanted to know if we could do that. Yeah. And the answer to that is that we can provide the algorithms, but we cannot provide the data. The data is owned by Thomson Reuters, and only they can run that kind of analysis and make it available. So my guess is that maybe they will in fact do such a thing. The implications of the feedback of that on science, I'm not quite sure what it would be.
Thanks, Brian. This is really amazing. I just want to clarify what the green tower meant. So is this high conventionality? And sometimes you see dev sets things like cutting edge conventionality. So what exactly is there in the conventional side? I understand that
Yeah.
the green tower has high tail novelty,
Yes.
but what was the difference between the conventionality?
So what it means is that when you look at the central tendency of citations in the paper, they are tending towards high conventionality. So the central tendency of all your pairings are pairings of things that people have seen a lot together before in the past, relative to our known model. So you want to get to the edge of that, and then add novelty. If you go all the way past that edge, so you use up everything and the paper's completely conventional, you do badly. You got to get like right to the frontier and then leave space for that novelty. Yes?
So the conventionality is really conventional, and then the innovation is really innovative in the green tower.
Yes, yes. Now, let me just say something about that, because we looked into that, and what we found I thought was something pretty interesting. We're not quite sure how to put this together. But it turns out that novelty is often two conventional sites that have never been put together before. So you take two things in a field of sociology that are very conventional. So you know it's conventional sites, people have seen it before, but you mix that with two conventional sites from computer science, and then that shows up in our model as novelty. A lot of novelty is nothing more than two conventional sites put together for the first time. We are really deeply embedded in conventionality. Steve. Oh, I'm sorry.
Whoever has the microphone.
Okay.
A quick question. So you showed that when you broke it out by field, 65% of fields, I think you said, had this pattern of the green tower, right?
Yes, very
and then,
good.
so then there's still a substantial minority, right? 35% where it's something else. I think on the chart it looked like the just conventional was the. So could you talk about what are some of the fields where just being completely conventional is the way to go?
Yeah, so, well, it's not that being completely conventional was the way to go. It just meant that that mixture wasn't the top. So sometimes it was one of the other three. So if you go into the Web of Science, there are a lot of fields that are small and maybe that you've never heard of. So, you know, there's like a subfield with inside architecture. There may be a subfield with inside biology that brings you all the way down to oncofertility. So these tend to be smaller fields that have this pattern of conventionality. And they tend to be fields that are not the ones that are called to mind easily. So I could give you some names just like I did, but that's the general way in which you look at it. I don't mean to be vague about it. I'm having a hard time myself thinking of every field that had that pattern. Do you remember a few of them, Satyan? Yeah, I mean, so we haven't, you know what, Luke, if you really want it, I'll get it for you. And then I'll send it off. That's the best I can say. But it's really that kind of pattern.
So there is also a competing interpretation.
Yeah.
The competing interpretation would be that, you know, to be a good scientist is the saying, unlike the social scientist, you not only have to show that you know the past, but you also have to show that you are right, because the nature is the verifier.
Uh-huh.
So think about it that way. A poorly written novel paper would just cite two, you know, different, you know, ideas, citing one paper, and then you have very high score because this paper are never cited together.
Mm-hmm.
But the well-written one would show that they are competent, therefore they would do the very conventional pairing of the papers, just showing, you know, if you go into network science, you would cite three famous network science papers, and then you would be very conventional in that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you tie it to the brain science, then you would cite another three very, you know, conventional brain papers, and then only score you get for, you know, for novelty would be across these two. But just by the fact that you want to show your competence, you have to have enough conventional papers, and that may be the effect. It's not that you have to have a lot of conventionality just by the fact that you document your point well across two disciplines. Each of these disciplines would be very conventional. Isn't that the model?
So let me see if I understand you correctly. You're saying that if there were another way to communicate to an audience, that you know the current state of knowledge.
Yes.
And that you've
That
given
will eliminate that.
Yeah, and then
but
you
the
give-
only way today is, if you talk about network science, if you just cite one paper, that could become considered not enough, and people doubt that you really know about network science. So you cite more to show that they are competent, but that makes your score conventional. And the same about your colleague who is brain scientist. But then you do across, so across these papers would link the score, so you have this effect which you observe. So it is not conventionality, but the proof of, of competence, which makes this conventional score happen.
So, Balak, I think that's an interesting hypothesis. We weren't able to get into that here because we don't have a way to go into all the papers and code them for how well they articulate past knowledge versus others, and whether the ones that simply do it by signaling, by having the right sites, do it better than the ones that don't. But I think that that could possibly be one of the reasons here. And I think that, Newton and Darwin understood this, and they, in some ways, needed to be able to communicate that, to be able to go the next step. But I think, fundamentally, if we are, in fact, best at doing that, on average, by drawing on previous work, I think the model holds, and I think that's what we found.
Sure, yes.
There's a review process. I mean, what you're talking about is going through the filters of reviewers. And that's what you're serving, right? You need there's a review process layered on top of this for what gets cited in ISI, and that necessity to present the conventionality in some given field to convince your peers that your idea has some merit. And so I think most authors, being good strategically in managing this process, know that they have to build this weight of evidence, and they only have enough room to do that one little baby step. They may be well beyond that, but you've got this filter in front of it. So I think that lines up. Now, I don't know that you can test that, but that's my intuition.
So we only have time maybe for 3 quick questions. We already had scheduled, I think, Ray and Ron.
I like your point about novelty is two conventional ideas from different disciplines. It leads to
But
an
not
obvious-
always, but a lot of times it is.
Okay. It leads to an obvious hypothesis, is that if you had teams and duos, as a matter of fact, of scientists from very different disciplines, would you see much higher tail novelty than if they came from the same discipline?
So, we looked at that because we were curious about it. And here's something that we found that I thought was pretty interesting. And that is all novel combinations are from different fields. Like 98% of all novel combinations are from different fields. It's like putting sociology and computer science together. However, not all interdisciplinary combinations are novel. It's kind of like all birds have wings, but not all animals with wings are birds. So simply thinking that it's an interdisciplinary effect is not the case. Why? Because some interdisciplinary combinations are in fact conventional.
So Brian, I'm wondering, is this about getting attention in one area or attention in multiple areas? So your outcome variable.
For the citations?
For the citations. Have you looked at, am I just garnering attention from people in sociology? Or do people in sociology and economics draw on my work?
So, Satya, we looked at this.
Yeah, so like we partitioned it according to science, the social science, and arts and humanities. And the results hold for all of them.
Yeah, he's asking something a little bit different though, I think. So you're saying that if you have a paper that's at that sweet spot, is it being cited by more fields?
Exactly.
Is it being
Or is
cited
it
by-
just popular in one area?
So,
So in multiple areas would give me a better indicator of creativity
So-
versus in one area.
let me just say we did like a Herfindahl index of what the distribution is across fields of the citations of the hit papers. What you find is that the hit papers, the ones in the green tower, do get cited. The distribution of citations is spread out across more fields than the other categories, but it wasn't a very big effect. It wasn't a very big effect.
So that's much more consistent with, I just need to say the right things to get attention from the right people, as opposed to other people outside my field think this is really novel and interesting.
Possibly. I mean, I don't really like these kind of explanations that we're all doing stuff to make reviewers happy. I just don't think that's true. I think you see a lot of times reviewers will ask people to put in citations and they don't do it. I think a lot of people think a lot about what citations are really the right ones. I just don't think that we're all that, instrumental in the stuff that we write. So possibly, but show me evidence for it. I don't know if people really do that. So that's my feeling on it.
One last question, Ron.
It's related to what Ray just said and the two gentlemen up in up in the front. When you presented this at the ASA meeting, this issue came up, and so I was wondering how your thinking had evolved over the last 60 days. There's a distinction between wrapping the development and producing development. The analysis, fantastic. The inference from the analysis is that it's a production process that you've captured, as opposed to writing the sales brochure for the work. And you've just given your sentiment that there's a strong correlation between those two. But when I was on Nosh's Sonic program, I learned an enormous amount from the computer scientists and framing things from them. But when I wrapped it for publication in AJS, it was, here's the main citations, here's the way it looks, and it wasn't facetious in terms of, well, I have to do this because the reviewers are wanting. I wanted to communicate with a community of practice where they understood things in certain ways. And if I wrote that for economists, it'd be written slightly differently. So it looks as though the conventionality is how to sell it rather than how to produce it. And that's the only distinction. I wonder how your thinking is evolving.
Yeah, so I don't particularly like the word sell. One thing is, all you're doing is you're signaling. Another is that when you actually do this, it does in the background affect your work about how you think about each step of that process of extending science. And from my point of view, that when you go through this and what we're showing is that has changed your thinking about how to extend and refine these ideas, and that comes out in the writing. It isn't just about dropping names. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you.